Unaware the disabled husband she divorced secretly inherited a massive trillion-dollar empire, Victoria Matthews abandoned him and their son for a rich suitor, but what he did next crushed her pride and shattered her new life in ways she never imagined possible. The woman who once pushed her wheelchair-bound husband out of their penthouse now watched from the shadows as he stood on his own 2 feet, commanding boardrooms across 5 continents. But the revelation that destroyed her came not from his wealth or his miraculous recovery. It came from the son she left behind, now heir to everything she had thrown away. How could the man she deemed worthless transform into the most powerful figure in global finance? What secret had he kept hidden behind those years of silence and supposed helplessness? And why did the child she abandoned look at her with eyes that held not hatred, but something far more devastating? Pity. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Crystal Heights ballroom, but Victoria Matthews barely noticed as she adjusted the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. The weight of it felt right, felt deserved, but the reflection staring back at her from the polished marble column held an expression she couldn't quite place. Tonight marked her engagement party to Douglas Pemberton, the real estate magnate whose net worth had been splashed across Forbes 3 months running, but something in her chest tightened as the string quartet began their 3rd Vivaldi piece. "You look radiant, darling," Douglas whispered, his hand possessive on her lower back, but his eyes were already scanning the room for his business associates. Victoria smiled the smile she'd perfected over the past 8 months, the one that hid everything real, everything that still woke her at 3 in the morning with her heart racing. The ballroom glittered with Manhattan's elite, but Victoria's mind drifted to a cramped apartment in Queens, to the man she'd left behind with divorce papers and a check she'd thought generous at the time. 3 years had passed since she'd walked out on James Richardson and their 4-year-old son, Ethan, but the memory still carried the sharp edges of justification she'd built around it like armor. James had been disabled, his legs paralyzed from a car accident 2 years into their marriage. But that wasn't why she'd left, she told herself for the 1,000th time. It was the poverty, the endless medical bills, the tiny apartment that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams. But mostly it was the look in his eyes that had driven her away, that patient, knowing look that said he understood her better than she understood herself. "Victoria, darling, come meet the Hendersons," Douglas called, but his voice sounded distant, tinny, like he was calling from the bottom of a well. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, but her heels felt unsteady on the polished floor. The Hendersons were old money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted, but their handshakes were firm, their smiles sharp as glass. They spoke of summer homes in the Hamptons and winters in Aspen, but Victoria found herself nodding automatically, her mind elsewhere. The flashback hit her without warning. Ethan's 4th birthday, the last one she'd spent with him. James had somehow scraped together enough money for a small cake from the discount bakery, but the candles had been mismatched, salvaged from a drawer of odds and ends. Her son's face had glowed in that candlelight, but Victoria had felt only shame, only the crushing weight of a life she hadn't chosen. "I'm going to marry someone who can give us everything," she'd whispered to James that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, clutching a stuffed bear that had seen better days. "Someone who isn't broken." James had looked at her from his wheelchair, his hands still strong despite everything else, but he'd simply nodded. "If that's what you need," he'd said quietly, "then go. But leave Ethan with me." The memory of that moment still had the power to steal her breath, but Victoria pushed it down, buried it under layers of champagne and congratulations. She'd made her choice, but choices had consequences she'd been too young to understand. "Mrs. Matthews, or should I say, soon-to-be Mrs. Pemberton," a voice cut through her thoughts, smooth as silk but edged with something else. Victoria turned to find herself face to face with a woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed in Chanel, but with eyes that seemed to see straight through her expensive facade. "I'm Margaret Chen," the woman continued, extending a hand heavy with tasteful jewelry. "I represent the Richardson Family Trust." The name hit Victoria like a physical blow, but she recovered quickly, her social mask sliding back into place. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met," she said carefully, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "No, we haven't, but I know quite a bit about you, dear. I know, for instance, that you were married to James Richardson. I know you left him when he needed you most, but what you don't know, what you've been blissfully unaware of for 3 years, is that the man you abandoned inherited one of the largest fortunes in modern history 6 months after you walked out." The ballroom seemed to tilt, but Victoria gripped the stem of her champagne glass harder. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed, but her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "James's grandfather, a man who'd made his fortune in technology and international trade before anyone knew those sectors would explode, died 18 months after your wedding," Margaret continued, her voice conversational but relentless. "He'd cut James out of the will years earlier, disappointed by his grandson's choice to pursue social work instead of business, but something changed when he heard about the accident. He watched James from afar, saw how he handled his disability with grace, how he raised his son alone after you left. But the old man was traditional. He waited, wanted to be sure James was truly worthy." Victoria's mind was racing, but she forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression neutral. Douglas was across the room, laughing too loudly at someone's joke, but he hadn't noticed this conversation yet. "The inheritance was released 6 months after your divorce was finalized," Margaret said softly, leaning closer. $3 trillion in liquid assets, property holdings across 40 countries, and controlling interest in 17 Fortune 500 companies. But James didn't touch it. Not immediately. He spent the first year in physical therapy, experimental treatments that his new wealth could finally afford. The doctors said it was impossible, but James never believed in impossible. The champagne glass slipped from Victoria's fingers, but it didn't shatter. A waiter caught it with practiced ease, replaced it with a napkin. "That's not possible," Victoria whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it was true. She could see it in Margaret's eyes, in the way the woman looked at her, with something between contempt and pity. "He walks now," Margaret continued, and each word was a nail in Victoria's carefully constructed coffin. "Has for about 18 months, but he kept it quiet, kept everything quiet. He didn't want the attention, didn't want Ethan growing up in that spotlight, but more than that, I think he wanted to see what you would do. If you would come back. If you would even wonder." The room was too hot, too bright, but Victoria couldn't move. Images flashed through her mind. James in his wheelchair, his patient eyes, his gentle hands on Ethan's small shoulders. But now those images were overlaid with something else. James standing, James walking, James commanding the kind of power that made Douglas look like a child playing dress-up. "Why are you telling me this?" Victoria finally asked, but her voice cracked on the last word. Margaret's expression shifted, became almost gentle. "Because tomorrow morning, the Richardson Foundation is announcing its largest initiative yet, $100 billion dedicated to disability services, accessible health care, and support for single parents. But the press conference isn't just about the money. James is stepping out of the shadows. He's taking his place in the world. But more than that, he's telling his story, your story. The woman who left him because he was broken, because he couldn't provide the life you wanted, but the woman who never knew that she'd walked away from everything she'd been chasing." The words landed like blows, but Victoria remained standing through sheer force of will. "He wouldn't," she said, but it sounded like a question even to herself. "He wouldn't name you. Wouldn't be cruel," Margaret agreed. "But the details are specific enough that anyone who knows you both will understand. But that's not the part that will destroy you, dear. That's not what will crush your pride and shatter this new life you've built." Victoria wanted to walk away, wanted to run, but her feet might as well have been cemented to the floor. "What then?" she whispered. Margaret's smile was sad now, almost sympathetic. "Ethan, your son, the boy you abandoned for this—" She gestured around the ballroom at the crystal chandeliers and the designer gowns and the carefully curated wealth. "He's 8 now, but he's brilliant. James enrolled him in the best schools, gave him every opportunity, but more than that, he talked to Ethan about you, honestly. No bitterness, no anger, just the truth. But the truth is sometimes the most devastating weapon of all." The room was spinning, but Victoria forced herself to focus. What did he tell him? That his mother loved him, but that she loved other things more, Margaret said simply. That sometimes people make choices that hurt others, but that doesn't make them monsters, just human. But Ethan is smart enough to understand what that means. He's smart enough to see the difference between the father who stayed and the mother who didn't. But here's what will break you, Victoria. Ethan doesn't hate you. He pities you. The word hung in the air between them, more damning than any accusation. "No," Victoria breathed, but even as she denied it, she knew it was true. "Tomorrow's press conference includes a video tribute," Margaret continued relentlessly. "Ethan made it himself, a presentation about the importance of character over circumstances, about how real strength isn't measured in bank accounts or working legs, but in the choices we make when everything is taken away. But the final slide is a photograph. You, James, and Ethan from that last birthday party, the one with the mismatched candles and the second-hand bear, but in Ethan's voiceover he talks about how that was the happiest day of his early childhood, not despite the poverty, but because everyone he loved was there. But then he talks about what happened next, how his mother left, how his father stayed, how he learned that love isn't about what you have, it's about what you're willing to sacrifice." Victoria's legs finally gave out, but she caught herself on the marble column, her manicured nails scraping against the cold stone. Across the room, Douglas had finally noticed something was wrong, but he was making his way over with obvious reluctance, his expression annoyed rather than concerned. "Why?" Victoria asked again, but this time the question was bigger, encompassing everything. "Why is he doing this?" Margaret's expression softened completely. "Because Ethan asked him to, but not out of revenge. Your son wants you to understand what you gave up. Not because he wants you to suffer, but because he wants you to grow. But there's more, Victoria. James has established a trust in your name. $10 million, completely yours, no strings attached. But it comes with a letter from Ethan explaining that he hopes this money will help you find whatever it was you were looking for when you left. But if it doesn't, if you're still empty after all this, then maybe you'll understand that it was never about the money at all." The cruelty of that kindness was staggering, but Victoria understood it immediately. James wasn't crushing her pride through revenge. He was crushing it through grace, through a generosity that highlighted exactly how small her own choices had been. "Tomorrow," Margaret said quietly, "the world will know James Richardson's story, but they'll also understand what you threw away. Not just the money, the man, the son, the life that mattered, but tonight, you still have this." She gestured around the ballroom again, at Douglas, who was almost within earshot now, his face red with irritation. "The question is, was it worth it?" Margaret melted back into the crowd before Douglas reached Victoria's side. "What was that about?" he demanded, but his tone was sharp, proprietary. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. Douglas Pemberton, with his Forbes-featured wealth and his connections and his penthouse views, but also with his wandering eyes and his conditional affection and his love that came with price tags and prenuptial agreements. She'd traded James's steady presence for this, had traded Ethan's small hand in hers for invitations to parties where nobody knew her name without checking the guest list first. "I'm not feeling well," she heard herself say, but her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I need to go home." Douglas's irritation flared into real anger. "This is our engagement party, Victoria, but you can't just leave. What will people think?" What will people think? The question that had driven so many of her choices, but suddenly Victoria understood that she'd been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't about what people thought, it was about what she could live with when the lights went out and she was alone with her choices. "I'm sorry," she said, but she was already walking toward the exit, her expensive heels clicking against marble that suddenly felt like ice. Behind her, she could hear Douglas sputtering, hear the murmur of confused guests, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The rain hit her the moment she stepped outside, but she welcomed it, tilted her face up to let it wash away 3 years of carefully applied makeup. Her phone was in her clutch, but her hands shook as she pulled it out as she searched for news about James Richardson. The results loaded slowly, but each headline was another knife twist. Reclusive billionaire to launch record-breaking foundation. Tech heir emerges after years of silence. Richardson legacy continues with revolutionary healthcare initiative. But none of the articles mentioned his disability, his recovery, the miracle of him walking again, because apparently that wasn't the story. The story was what he was doing with his second chance, with his impossible wealth, with the platform he'd never asked for but was using anyway. Victoria's taxi pulled up, but she didn't get in immediately. Instead, she stood in the rain, scrolling through article after article, searching for some mention of herself. But there was nothing. James had kept her out of it completely, had protected her, even as he stepped into the spotlight. But Margaret had been right. That protection was its own form of exposure, because anyone who knew their story would fill in the blanks. The apartment James had shared with Ethan was in Queens, but Victoria found herself giving the taxi driver that address instead of her own sleek Tribeca loft. It was nearly midnight, but she needed to see it, needed to understand what she'd left behind. The building looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier, but the lights were still on in what had been their third-floor walk-up. Victoria stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk, staring up at those windows, but she couldn't make herself go inside. What would she even say? Her phone buzzed. Douglas, angry and demanding, but she silenced it without reading the full message. Another buzz. Her mother, who'd been at the party, probably demanding explanations, but Victoria silenced that too. A third buzz, but this one was from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her open the message. It was a video file, and against her better judgment, Victoria clicked play. Ethan's face filled the screen, older than she remembered, but with James's eyes and her own stubborn chin. He was standing in what looked like a library, surrounded by books and light, but his expression was serious beyond his years. "Hi, Mom," he said, and Victoria's knees buckled. She sat down hard on the wet curb, rain soaking through her expensive dress, but she couldn't look away from the screen. "Dad said I could send this to you if I wanted, but he also said I should wait until I was sure." "I'm sure now." Ethan glanced down at something off-screen. Notes, maybe, or maybe just gathering his courage. "I don't remember you very well, but Dad has lots of pictures and he tells me stories. Good stories about how you used to sing to me, about how you made the best pancakes, about how you tried really hard even when things were difficult. But I know why you left." Dad explained it. "He said you were looking for something you thought you'd lost, and you believed you'd find it somewhere else." The video was time-stamped from 3 weeks ago, but Ethan's words were clearly carefully considered. "I wanted you to know that we're okay, but I also wanted you to know that I forgive you, even though Dad says you didn't do anything that needs my forgiveness. He says you made a choice and that everyone has the right to make choices. But I'm 8 now, and I'm old enough to understand that some choices hurt people even when we don't mean them to." Victoria was crying now, but silently, her shoulders shaking as rain mixed with tears on her face. "Tomorrow Dad is going to tell everyone about our story," Ethan continued. "But he's not doing it to hurt you. He's doing it because he wants people to understand that disability doesn't define worth, that circumstances don't define character. But I asked him to let me say something too, and this is what I want to say. I wish you'd stayed, but I understand why you didn't, and I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do, but if you ever want to talk, if you ever want to meet for coffee or something, Dad says that would be okay with him. It would be okay with me, too." The video ended, but Victoria couldn't move. She sat on that wet curb, her phone clutched in both hands, and felt every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her choices crumble to nothing. A car pulled up, not her taxi, which had long since driven away, but a black town car with tinted windows. The back door opened, but nobody got out. Instead, Margaret Chen's voice carried from inside. "He knew you'd come here, knew you'd need to see it, but he's not there. He and Ethan are at the foundation offices preparing for tomorrow, but if you want to see them, if you want to actually talk instead of just looking, there's room in this car." Victoria looked up at the apartment windows again, but they seemed impossibly far away now, separated by more than just 3 floors and a few years. They were separated by choices, by consequences, by the life she'd walked away from, and the man who'd built something extraordinary from the ruins she'd left behind. "What if I can't face them?" Victoria whispered, but she was already standing, already moving toward the car. "Then you can't," Margaret said simply, "but running away again won't change what happens tomorrow. It won't change what you've lost, but facing it might change what happens next." Victoria slid into the car, but she couldn't speak. The leather seats were butter soft, the interior climate-controlled and perfect, but she felt none of it. All she could think about was Ethan's face on that video, James's patient eyes in her memories, and the 3 years she'd spent building a life on a foundation of running away. The foundation offices were in a gleaming tower in Midtown, but the building was mostly dark except for the top floor. Margaret led her to a private elevator, keyed in a code, but said nothing as they ascended. The silence was profound, giving Victoria too much time to think, too much space for panic. The elevator doors opened onto a vast office space, but it wasn't cold or corporate. Instead, it felt lived in, human, with photographs covering one entire wall. James and Ethan at baseball games, on hiking trips, at school functions, living a life Victoria hadn't been part of, building memories that didn't include her. "He's in the conference room," Margaret said quietly. "End of the hall, but I should warn you, he's different from the man you remember, not because of the money or even because he can walk again, but because he's made peace with who he is, with what happened. But that doesn't mean seeing you won't be difficult for him. Just be kind. To both of you." Victoria nodded, but she couldn't find words. She walked down that hallway on legs that felt like water, past office doors with nameplates she didn't recognize, past evidence of a life and career and purpose that had flourished without her. The conference room door was ajar, and through it, Victoria could see him. James was standing at the window, his back to the door, but his posture was confident, strong. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe he just stood straighter now that pain wasn't his constant companion. Ethan sat at the conference table working on a laptop, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, exactly the way James used to do. Victoria must have made some sound because both of them turned, but their reactions couldn't have been more different. Ethan's face lit up with something between hope and uncertainty, but James's expression was carefully neutral, guarded in a way she'd never seen from him before. "Victoria," James said, and his voice was the same, warm, steady, but there was distance in it now, the space carved out by 3 years of absence. "Margaret said you might come." Victoria's voice failed her, but she tried again. "I got Ethan's video." I told him to send it, James said quietly, moving away from the window. And that's when Victoria really saw it. The ease of his movement, the absence of pain that had always lingered at the edges of his expression, but also something else. Confidence. Purpose. The bearing of a man who'd faced the worst and come out stronger. "Dad," Ethan said softly, glancing between them. "Should I—" "Stay," James and Victoria said simultaneously, but then James added, "If you want to. This concerns you too." Ethan nodded, but his eyes never left Victoria's face. She could see him cataloging details, her ruined dress, her smeared makeup, the way she stood uncertain in the doorway like a stranger in a stranger's home. "I didn't know," Victoria said, and the words came out broken. "About the inheritance, about any of it, but that's not an excuse. That's not why I came." "Why did you come?" James asked, but his tone wasn't harsh. Just curious. "After 3 years, after building your new life, why now?" Victoria finally stepped fully into the room, but she kept distance between them. "Because I watched you leave that birthday party on repeat in my mind for 3 years, but I convinced myself I'd made the right choice. That you and Ethan would be better off without me dragging you down. That I was doing everyone a favor, but then Margaret told me about tomorrow, about what you're announcing, and I realized—" She broke off, but James waited, patient as always. "I realized I didn't leave because you were disabled," Victoria continued, her voice strengthening. "I left because I was disabled, but not in my legs, in my heart, in my ability to see what mattered, but you already knew that, didn't you? You knew all along." James's expression softened slightly. "I knew you were unhappy, but I also knew I couldn't give you what you thought you needed, not then. The accident took so much from me, my mobility, my career prospects, my ability to provide, but I had to learn that those things weren't what defined me, weren't what made me worthy of love, but you needed to learn that too, and I couldn't teach you. You had to figure it out yourself." "Did I?" Victoria asked, but it was a genuine question. "Have I figured it out, or am I just here because I finally understand the magnitude of what I gave up?" The question hung in the air, but it was Ethan who answered. "Does it matter?" he asked, his young voice cutting through the tension. "I mean, does it matter why you're here as long as you're actually seeing us? Actually trying?" Victoria looked at her son, really looked at him for the first time since she'd walked into the room. He was so much older than 4 now, but more than that, he was wise in ways that broke her heart. He'd grown up without her, but he'd grown up well, and that was entirely James's doing. "I don't know if I have the right to try," Victoria admitted. "I walked away. I chose Douglas and his money over you and your father, but I wasn't just wrong about what mattered. I was cruel. I was—" "Human," James interrupted gently. "You were human, Victoria, but humans make mistakes. They get scared and they run, but they also have the capacity to grow, to change, to choose differently." Victoria's tears came freely now, but she didn't hide them. "I don't deserve your grace," she whispered. "Probably not," James agreed, but there was no meanness in it. "But grace isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to give something anyway, but I'm not offering you redemption, Victoria. I'm not offering you a place back in our lives like nothing happened. But if you're genuinely here to understand, to acknowledge what happened, and take responsibility, then we can talk. We can see if there's a path forward, but it won't be easy, and it won't erase the past." Victoria nodded, but she couldn't speak. She looked at Ethan, at the hope carefully tempered with caution in his eyes, and understood that this moment was a gift she didn't deserve, but was being given anyway. "The press conference is tomorrow at 9, James said. "You're welcome to be there or not. That's your choice, but either way, the story is going out. The truth about what happened, about the choices we all made. But Ethan and I have already processed this. We've already healed as much as we can without you. But if you want to be part of healing with us, that's different. That's new, but it requires showing up. Actually showing up, not just when it's convenient or when you're scared of looking bad. I want to, Victoria said, but her voice was small. I want to show up, but I don't know if I know how anymore. Ethan stood then, walked over to her with his father's steady confidence, but when he reached her, he didn't hug her. Instead, he held out his hand. Then maybe we figure it out together, he said simply. Not like before, not pretending nothing happened, but like people who hurt each other, but want to do better. Victoria took his hand, but the touch sent shockwaves through her entire system. This was her son, but he was also a stranger, and bridging that gap would take more than one conversation, more than one moment of clarity. Tomorrow, James said quietly, the world is going to see our story, but they're going to see it through the lens of resilience, of overcoming, of choosing to build something good from something broken. But what they won't see is this moment right here where we're all standing in the wreckage of what was and trying to decide what comes next. But that's the real story, Victoria. Not the money, not the miraculous recovery, but the choice to keep trying even when it would be easier to walk away. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow because she heard the echo of her own choice in them. But James's face held no accusation, only a sad sort of understanding. I need to tell Douglas, Victoria heard herself say. I need to end that before I can even think about what comes next. Do you want to? Ethan asked, but his grip on her hand had tightened slightly. End it, I mean, or do you feel like you have to because of us? The maturity of the question staggered her. Both, Victoria admitted. I want to because I finally see what I've been hiding from, but I have to because staying with him would be repeating the same mistake, just in a different direction. But mostly, I want to because I need to prove to myself that I can make a hard choice for the right reasons instead of an easy choice for the wrong ones. James nodded slowly. Then that's what you should do, but Victoria, don't do it tonight. Don't do it in reaction to this. Go home. Sleep on it. Make sure you're choosing, not just reacting. The wisdom in that made Victoria want to weep. This was the man she'd left behind, but he was also so much more than the man she'd known. He'd grown in her absence, had become someone she might not recognize if she'd met him on the street. But the core of him, that patient, steady core, was still there. Thank you, she whispered, but the words felt insufficient for everything she wanted to say. We'll see you tomorrow, James said, but it wasn't quite a question. At the press conference or after, your choice, but we'll see you. It was both a promise and a challenge, but Victoria understood both. She nodded, squeezed Ethan's hand once more, and turned to leave. Margaret was waiting by the elevator, but her expression was unreadable. How did it go? She asked as the doors closed. I don't know, Victoria admitted, but I think that's the point. I think I'm supposed to not know, but keep showing up anyway. Margaret smiled then, genuine warmth breaking through her professional facade. Then maybe you're finally learning what your ex-husband already knows, that the only way forward is one uncertain step at a time, but taking those steps anyway. The ride down was silent, but Victoria's mind was screaming. She'd spent 3 years building a life based on running from uncertainty, from difficulty, from anything that required her to be uncomfortable. But now she stood on the edge of something entirely different, a chance to be uncomfortable on purpose, to choose difficulty because it led somewhere real. The rain had stopped by the time Margaret's car dropped her at her Tribeca loft, but the street still gleamed wetly under the streetlights. Victoria's phone had been buzzing non-stop during the drive. Douglas, her mother, friends from the party demanding gossip, but she silenced it all. Inside her apartment, surrounded by expensive furniture and carefully curated art, Victoria felt the full weight of her choices crash over her. This place was beautiful but hollow, impressive but empty, and she'd traded her family for it. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by her window and watched the city wake up, watched the sun rise over buildings full of people making their own choices, their own mistakes, their own attempts at redemption. Somewhere in Queens, in an apartment she'd once fled, James and Ethan were probably doing the same thing, but together. At 7 a.m., Victoria called Douglas, but she didn't wait for pleasantries. "I can't marry you," she said simply. "I'm sorry for the mess at the party, sorry for wasting your time, but I need to end this cleanly." Douglas's response was immediate and volcanic. "Are you insane? Do you know what you're throwing away? Who I am?" And there it was, the question that had driven Victoria for 3 years, but suddenly she had an answer. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know exactly who you are, but more importantly, I finally know who I am, but I don't like her very much. I need to figure out how to change that." She hung up before he could respond, but the finality of it felt right, felt clean. One door closing, but what came next was entirely uncertain. The press conference was being held at the Richardson Foundation's new headquarters, a converted historic building in downtown Manhattan that James had apparently restored personally. Victoria arrived early, but stayed in the back of the press room, anonymous in jeans and a simple sweater that felt like armor compared to last night's designer dress. The room filled quickly, journalists, photographers, foundation staff, but Victoria kept her eyes on the podium, waiting. When James walked out, the room erupted in camera flashes, but he moved through it with ease. He was wearing a simple suit, but he commanded the space like he'd been doing this all his life. Ethan walked beside him, small but confident, and Victoria's heart clenched at the sight. James's speech was everything Margaret had promised. Powerful, moving, focused on the Foundation's mission, but also deeply personal. He talked about his accident, about learning to live with disability, about the challenges that had seemed insurmountable. But he also talked about Ethan, about fatherhood, about finding purpose in helping others navigate paths he'd already walked. He never mentioned Victoria by name, but he didn't have to. "I learned," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room, "that the people who stay with you in the darkness matter more than those who only want to stand in your light. But I also learned that everyone's journey is their own. Some people aren't ready to face difficulty until they've exhausted every avenue of escape, but that doesn't make them villains. It makes them human." The grace of it broke Victoria completely, but she stayed silent, stayed still. Then it was Ethan's turn, but he didn't read from notes. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "My dad taught me that strength isn't about being perfect," he said, his young voice surprisingly steady. "It's about getting back up, but also about letting people see you when you're down. But the most important thing he taught me is that love isn't about what you have. It's about what you give, but you can only give what you've learned to receive." The presentation included the video Ethan had made, but it was different from the one Victoria had seen. This version was public, carefully edited to respect privacy while still telling truth, but the photograph at the end was the same: Victoria, James, and Ethan, before everything broke. When the presentation ended, the questions started, but James handled them with the same grace he'd shown throughout. Yes, he was walking again. Yes, the inheritance had changed his life. But no, wealth wasn't what had saved him. Purpose had. Love had. The daily choice to keep showing up even when every instinct screamed to give up. Victoria waited until the press conference ended, until the crowd began to disperse, but she didn't approach. Instead, she caught James's eye across the room, and in that brief connection, she saw everything she needed to know. He'd told their story, but he'd protected her in the telling. He'd been honest without being cruel, truthful without being vindictive. She mouthed 2 words: "Thank you." James nodded once, but then Ethan was tugging on his sleeve, pointing at something, and the moment passed. Victoria left without speaking to them, but this time it wasn't running away. It was recognizing that the press conference had been their moment, their story to tell, and her presence would have made it about her instead of about them. But she'd been there, she'd shown up, but that was a start. Over the following weeks, Victoria dismantled her old life methodically but completely. She ended things with Douglas formally, endured her mother's disappointment and her social circle's gossip, but she did it all with a strange sense of peace. She wasn't running toward something this time, but away from people and places that had never been real. She started therapy, real therapy, but she didn't tell James or Ethan about it. This wasn't for them. It was for her, but it was also the first step toward becoming someone who might deserve a second chance. She took the $10 million from the trust James had established, but she didn't touch it beyond investing it conservatively. She didn't deserve that money yet, but maybe someday she'd figure out how to use it for something that mattered. She got a job at a nonprofit that helped low-income families navigate the healthcare system. Unglamorous work that paid a fraction of what Douglas would have given her, but that made her feel human again. But most importantly, she sent Ethan letters. Not emails, not texts, but actual handwritten letters about her life, her therapy, the things she was learning, but she never asked for forgiveness. She never asked for a place in his life. She just showed up on paper week after week. 3 months after the press conference, Ethan wrote back, but his letter was brief. Dad says we can have coffee if you want. Saturday at 10. There's a place near us. Victoria cried over that letter for an hour, but then she wrote back, I'd like that very much. The coffee shop was small, cramped, nothing like the places she used to frequent with Douglas, but James and Ethan were already there when she arrived. They'd chosen a corner table but had left her a seat facing both of them. Hi, Victoria said, but the word felt inadequate for the moment. Hi, Ethan replied, but he was smiling, small, cautious, but real. James didn't say anything, but he pushed a cup of coffee toward her. Black, 2 sugars, the way she used to drink it before she decided that was too pedestrian. They talked for 2 hours, but they didn't talk about the past. Instead, they talked about Ethan's school, about James's foundation work, about the small moments that made up their daily lives. But Victoria contributed too, told them about her job, about her therapy, about the tiny apartment she'd rented in Brooklyn that had terrible water pressure but great light. When it was time to leave, Ethan hugged her, but it was brief, still uncertain. Same time next week? He asked. If you want, Victoria said, but she couldn't keep the hope out of her voice. We want, James said quietly, speaking for the first time in 20 minutes. But Victoria, this is a long road. There's no finish line where everything is suddenly fixed. I know, she said, and she meant it. But I'm learning that showing up for the long road is better than sprinting toward the wrong destination. James smiled then, but it was sad and proud and complicated. Then we'll see you next week. That became their rhythm, weekly coffee, careful conversations, building something new from the ruins of what had been. But Victoria never asked for more than they offered, never pushed. She'd learned, finally, that love wasn't about taking. It was about being present, about showing up consistently, about earning trust through actions rather than words. 6 months after that first coffee meeting, James invited her to Ethan's 9th birthday party, but he was careful to set boundaries. It's at our place, he said, and there will be other people there, Ethan's friends, some of my colleagues, but you're welcome to come if you want. Not as my ex-wife, just as someone who cares about Ethan. Victoria went, but she brought a simple gift, a book about resilience that her therapist had recommended, but with an inscription from her heart. For Ethan, who taught me what real strength looks like, but I'm still learning. Love, Mom. The party was loud, chaotic, full of children and laughter, but Victoria stayed on the edges watching. She saw James navigate the chaos with easy confidence, saw Ethan shine in the center of it all, but she also saw the life they'd built without her. Full and rich and complete. At the end of the party, after the other guests had left, Ethan found her sitting quietly in the kitchen. Thanks for coming, he said, but then he held up the book. And thanks for this, but mostly thanks for showing up. Dad says that's the hardest part. Just keep showing up even when it's awkward. Your dad's right, Victoria said, but I'm trying to learn from the best teacher. Ethan grinned then, but it was the first completely unguarded smile he'd given her. You're doing okay, he said. Not great yet, but okay is a start. And it was. But Victoria was finally learning that okay was enough. That progress wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but about small, consistent choices, but about showing up even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. A year after the press conference, James invited her to a foundation event, but this time as a volunteer who'd been making real contributions. She'd started leading support groups for parents navigating disability services, using her own story, carefully, honestly, as a cautionary tale, but also as hope that people could change. At the event, standing in a room full of people whose lives the foundation was changing, Victoria finally understood what she'd lost and what she might, possibly, someday earn back. But the loss wasn't the money or the security or the social status. It was the knowledge that she'd walked away from people who loved her unconditionally, but had to learn to love herself first before she could accept that love. James found her during a quiet moment, handed her a glass of sparkling water. You've done good work this year, he said simply. I've tried, Victoria replied, but she met his eyes steadily. I'm still trying. I know, James said, and something in his expression shifted. We both see it, but Ethan and I have been talking, and we wanted you to know. You're not on trial anymore. You're not proving yourself. You're just here, but that's enough. The words should have brought relief, but instead, they brought fresh tears. Is it? Victoria whispered. Is it enough after everything? It's enough for today, James said gently. Tomorrow. We'll figure out tomorrow, but that's all any of us can do, right? Just keep showing up for the todays until eventually they add up to something. Victoria nodded, but she couldn't speak. Across the room, Ethan was laughing with some other kids from his school, but he caught her eye and waved. Not frantically, not with desperation, but just normally, but like she was someone he was glad to see. That wave, more than anything else, told Victoria that she'd finally learned what James and Ethan had known all along, that pride could be rebuilt through humility, that lives could be reconstructed from honest rubble, but that the most powerful empires weren't built from money or status. They were built from the daily choice to love imperfectly but persistently. She'd walked away from a disabled husband and their son for a rich suitor, but she'd lost $1 trillion empire. But more than that, she'd lost herself. But slowly, painfully, through the grace of two people who had every right to turn away, she was finding herself again. Not the polished, perfect version she'd tried to become, but something messier, more real, more human. And in learning to be human again, Victoria discovered that the greatest wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in second chances offered, in forgiveness earned, in the slow, difficult work of becoming someone worthy of the love she'd once thrown away. But the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. One awkward coffee date, one volunteered hour, one small step at a time towards something she'd finally learned to value more than all the crystal ballrooms and diamond necklaces in the world. The quiet, steady presence of people who chose to love her anyway. 5 years had passed since the press conference that shattered Victoria's pride, but the woman who stood in the foundation's sunlit atrium bore little resemblance to the one who'd fled her engagement party in the rain. Her hair was pulled back simply, her clothes were practical rather than designer, but her eyes held something they'd never possessed before. Peace earned through 5 years of showing up, even when every instinct screamed to run. "Mom, you're going to be late," Ethan called from across the lobby, but his voice carried affection rather than irritation. He was 13 now, taller than Victoria by 3 inches, but still with that same serious expression that made him seem older than his years. Victoria checked her watch and smiled. "Your dad's the one who's late, not me," she said, but there was no edge to it, just the comfortable teasing that had slowly, painfully grown between them over half a decade of consistent effort. "Dad's always late to his own events," Ethan replied, rolling his eyes with theatrical exasperation. But then James emerged from the elevator, his expression harried but apologetic. "Traffic was insane," he said, but he was already straightening his tie, shifting into the public persona that still didn't quite fit him despite 5 years of practice. "Is everyone here?" "Everyone except the mayor, but she texted that she's 5 minutes out," Victoria answered, consulting her tablet with the efficiency she'd developed as the Foundation's Director of Family Services. It wasn't a prestigious title, and it certainly didn't come with the social cash of being Mrs. Douglas Pemberton, but it meant something real. James nodded, but then he caught Victoria's eye and something passed between them. Not romance, not anymore, but something deeper. Partnership, perhaps, or recognition, but mostly it was the acknowledgement of two people who'd traveled impossible distances to reach a place where they could stand in the same room without the weight of the past crushing them both. The Foundation was unveiling its newest initiative today, a nationwide network of support centers for families dealing with sudden disability, but the project had been Victoria's idea, born from her own failures and rebuilt through 5 years of listening to other people's stories. "You ready?" James asked her quietly, but he knew the answer already. "As I'll ever be," Victoria replied, but her hands were steady as she gathered her notes. 5 years ago, they would have been shaking. The auditorium filled quickly. Families the Foundation had helped, journalists covering the expansion, board members and donors, but also people from Victoria's past who'd slowly, cautiously, filtered back into her life as she'd proven through years of consistent action that her transformation was genuine rather than performative. Her mother sat in the 3rd row, but her expression was complicated. They'd rebuilt their relationship slowly through therapy sessions and difficult conversations, but Ellen Matthews had finally accepted that her daughter's new life, smaller, less glamorous, but infinitely more meaningful, was a choice rather than a failure. Douglas Pemberton was not in attendance, but Victoria had heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd married someone else within 6 months of their breakup. She felt nothing about that except a distant relief that she'd escaped before binding herself permanently to a life that would have destroyed her. James opened the ceremony with his characteristic grace, but Victoria noticed the small changes 5 years had brought. He was more comfortable in his skin now, more willing to claim space, but he still deflected attention whenever possible, preferring to highlight the people doing the actual work rather than those funding it. When he introduced Victoria, his words were simple but devastating in their sincerity. 5 years ago, I told a story about resilience and redemption, but I told it incompletely. I talked about my own journey, but I didn't talk about the journey of someone who had to travel even further, back from a place of profound regret toward something resembling forgiveness, but more importantly, toward self-forgiveness. Victoria Matthews has spent the last 5 years building something remarkable, not from privilege or wealth, but from the honest acknowledgement of her own failures and the daily choice to do better. Victoria walked to the podium with tears already burning behind her eyes, but she'd learned to speak through emotion rather than hiding from it. "Thank you, James," she said, but then she turned to face the audience fully. 5 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. I abandoned my disabled husband and our young son because I believed that security and status mattered more than love and character. But I was wrong in ways that took me years to fully understand. The room was silent, but Victoria had told this story dozens of times now in support groups and therapy sessions. Each telling was easier, but it never stopped hurting, and she'd learned that was appropriate. Some pains should hurt, because forgetting them meant risking repetition. I can't undo what I did, Victoria continued, but I can use it. I can take the worst choice I ever made and transform it into something that helps other people avoid making similar mistakes or helps them find their way back when they do. But this initiative, these support centers we're launching, they're built on a simple principle, that crisis reveals character, but character can be rebuilt. Not easily, not quickly, but consistently, through small choices made over and over until they become who you are rather than who you were. She spoke for 20 minutes, but she didn't read from notes. Instead, she told stories, families she'd worked with, parents who'd stayed when every instinct said to run, children who'd forgiven when forgiveness seemed impossible, but also people who'd left and come back, who'd failed and tried again, who'd proven that redemption was possible even when it seemed impossibly distant. When she finished, the applause was generous, but Victoria barely heard it. She was looking at Ethan sitting in the front row between James's empty seat and her mother, but her son was smiling, not the careful, guarded smile of their early reunions, but something open and genuine. After the ceremony, during the reception, people approached Victoria with questions and congratulations, but she handled it with the same grace she'd learned from watching James, over 5 years of weekly coffee dates that had gradually expanded into family dinners, then collaborative work projects, then something that resembled actual co-parenting rather than supervised visits. "That was really good, Mom," Ethan said, appearing at her elbow with a plate of appetizers he clearly had no intention of eating. "The part about crisis revealing character but not defining it, that's going to help a lot of people." Victoria touched his shoulder briefly, but she'd learned not to be too effusive, not to demand more affection than he was ready to give. "Thank you, sweetheart, but I learned it from you and your dad." Ethan shrugged, but he looked pleased. "Yeah, but we learned it by living it, and you learned it by choosing it. But Dad says that's actually harder. Choosing to change when you could just stay comfortable." The wisdom in that observation reminded Victoria that her son was becoming someone extraordinary, but she couldn't take credit for it. That was entirely James's doing, built through years of patient fathering while she'd been chasing fool's gold in crystal ballrooms. "How's school?" Victoria asked, shifting to safer ground. But Ethan immediately launched into an explanation of his science fair project that involved water purification systems for developing nations. He was passionate, articulate, focused on making a difference, but Victoria recognized that he'd inherited James's heart, even if he'd inherited her stubborn chin. James joined them after working the room with practiced efficiency, but he looked tired. 5 years of running a foundation with global reach had taken their toll, though he'd never complain about it. "You okay?" Victoria asked quietly, but her concern was genuine rather than performative. "Just thinking," James replied, but then he smiled slightly. 5 years ago today, we had coffee for the first time, but do you remember?" Victoria did. She remembered everything about that day, from her shaking hands to Ethan's cautious smile, to the way James had pushed that cup of coffee toward her like it was both a test and an invitation. "I remember," she said softly. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," James admitted, but this was new. He rarely talked about those early months, preferring to focus on the present rather than the painful past. "I thought maybe seeing us at the press conference would be enough, that you'd go back to your life and we'd become a story you told at parties about the road not taken." "I almost did," Victoria confessed, but honesty had become her default setting over 5 years of therapy and hard work. "I sat outside that coffee shop for 20 minutes trying to decide if I could handle it. But then I saw you and Ethan through the window, and you were laughing about something, and I realized that walking away again would kill whatever small piece of me was still worth saving." Ethan was watching them both with his characteristic seriousness, but he didn't interrupt. He'd learned over the years to let his parents have these moments, not romantic, not moving toward reconciliation, but something equally valuable. Resolution, perhaps, or recognition of the strange, complicated thing they'd built from the ruins of their marriage. "I'm glad you stayed," James said simply, but then he added, "Not for me, not even for Ethan, though he needed you more than he could admit, but for you, because the person you've become over these 5 years is someone worth knowing. But the person you were 5 years ago was drowning, and watching you drown without being able to help was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced." The confession hung between them, but Victoria understood it wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to acknowledge that they'd both suffered, both grown, both traveled impossible distances to reach this moment of standing together without the weight of resentment crushing them. "Can I say something?" Ethan interjected, but he wasn't really asking permission. "This is going to sound weird, but I think I'm glad everything happened the way it did." Both adults turned to stare at him, but Ethan continued with the fearless honesty of someone who'd grown up with therapy, as normal as breathing. "If you hadn't left, Mom, you probably would have stayed resentful forever. But Dad would have felt guilty forever, and I would have grown up in a house full of people who loved each other but couldn't like each other but this way. With you leaving and coming back, we all had to choose each other. We all had to decide that being family was more important than being right or being comfortable, but that's stronger than just never breaking in the first place." Victoria felt something crack in her chest, but it wasn't breaking. It was the final piece of her carefully constructed guilt falling away. "When did you get so wise?" she whispered. "I had good teachers," Ethan replied, but he looked at both of them equally. "One who taught me how to stay and one who taught me how to come back, but both of those things matter." James cleared his throat roughly, but his eyes were suspiciously bright. "We should probably mingle," he said, but nobody moved. Instead, they stood together, not a family in the traditional sense, not anymore, but something new. Victoria had spent 5 years trying to find the word for what they'd become, but she'd finally accepted that maybe there wasn't a word. Maybe it was just the three of them, imperfect and complicated, but choosing each other day after day after day. "Hey," Ethan said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "We should take a picture, but not one of those fake posed ones, just us, like this." He held up his phone, but the selfie he captured showed 3 people, standing close but not touching, smiling but not perfectly, together but maintaining their own space. Victoria on one side, James on the other, Ethan in the middle, holding them together not through obligation but through choice. "I'm going to print this," Ethan announced, examining the result critically. "Put it in my room next to the one from my 4th birthday, but that way I can remember where we started and where we ended up." "We haven't ended up anywhere," Victoria corrected gently. "We're still figuring it out." "Yeah," Ethan agreed, "but that's kind of the point, right? We're figuring it out together instead of apart." The reception continued around them, but Victoria felt the full weight of the last 5 years settle into something resembling peace. She hadn't gotten her family back, not in the way she'd once imagined it, not in the way her mother still sometimes hoped, but she'd gotten something perhaps more valuable. She'd gotten the chance to be part of their lives, not through entitlement or obligation, but through earning it slowly, painfully, one small choice at a time. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the catering staff were cleaning up, Victoria found herself alone in the foundation's atrium with James. Ethan had left with Victoria's mother for a promised dinner at his favorite restaurant, but the 2 adults had stayed behind to handle final details. "Thank you," Victoria said into the comfortable silence, but James looked up from his tablet with confusion. "For what?" "For letting me come back," Victoria said simply. "For not making it easy, but for not making it impossible either, but mostly for raising Ethan into someone who can hold space for complexity, who can understand that people can be flawed and still worth loving." James set down his tablet and looked at her directly. You did that too, he said quietly. Not the raising part. I won't pretend you were there for that. But the part about teaching him that people can change. That matters too, but Victoria, I need to tell you something. Victoria's chest tightened, but she nodded. I've been offered a position, James continued, heading up a disability rights initiative in Geneva, but it's a 2-year commitment and it would mean Ethan and I relocating, but I wanted to talk to you about it before making any decisions. The old Victoria would have panicked, would have seen this as abandonment or punishment, but 5 years of therapy and growth meant she could hear it for what it was, a professional opportunity and a courtesy. When? She asked calmly. Not until summer, but 6 months, James said. Plenty of time to figure out logistics, but Ethan's at an age where he could stay with you for part of it, if that's something you both want. Alternate months, maybe, or summers and holidays, but I wanted to see how you felt about that before discussing it with him. Victoria sat with the question, but she didn't rush to answer. 5 years ago, she would have seen this as a test she had to pass, but now she understood it was simply a decision that required honest assessment of her capabilities and limitations. I'd like that, she finally said, but I'd want to talk to Ethan about what he wants, not what he thinks we want him to want, and I'd want to set up regular video calls, clear expectations, systems to make sure he never feels like he's being shuttled around. But yes, I'd like the chance to be his primary parent for part of that time, if he's comfortable with it. James smiled, but it was real and warm. That's exactly the right answer, but not because it's what I wanted to hear, because it's thoughtful and honest and puts Ethan first. But 5 years ago, you couldn't have given that answer. 5 years ago, I couldn't have done a lot of things, Victoria agreed. But I'm not that person anymore, thank God. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, but then James said something that changed everything. I'm proud of you, but I don't know if I've ever said that. Not because I'm your ex-husband and my opinion should matter, but because I know how hard you've worked to become someone different from who you were, and that takes a kind of courage most people never develop. Victoria felt tears threatening, but she blinked them back. I had good motivation, she said softly. I had a son worth changing for and an ex-husband who held the door open just wide enough that I could find my way back, but thank you for saying it, but more importantly, for meaning it. James stood, gathering his things, but he paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said, I don't regret any of it anymore, but not because it wasn't painful, God knows it was, but because it led here to this version of us that actually works. But sometimes I think the universe breaks things on purpose, just to see if we're brave enough to rebuild them into something new instead of trying to glue the old pieces back together. After he left, Victoria sat alone in the atrium, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt something else, complete maybe, or at least complete enough. She'd spent 5 years trying to earn back what she'd thrown away, but somewhere along the journey she'd realized she didn't want the old life back. She wanted this new one, complicated and imperfect, but real in ways her marriage had never been. Her phone buzzed, a text from Ethan with a photo of him and his grandmother making faces at the camera. The message read, Grandma says to tell you the speech was perfect. I say it was pretty good. Love you. See you Wednesday? Victoria smiled and typed back, Love you too. Wednesday works. Tell Grandma I said thank you. 3 simple exchanges, but they represented 5 years of rebuilding, of showing up, of earning the right to be part of her son's daily life rather than a distant memory or cautionary tale. She stood, gathered her things, but took one last look around the foundation's atrium. This place built on James's wealth but dedicated to helping people who had nothing. This space where she'd found purpose after years of chasing status. This building that represented everything she'd lost and everything she'd found in losing it. The woman who'd abandoned her disabled husband and their son for a rich suitor was gone. But in her place stood someone harder, softer, more real. Someone who'd had her pride crushed and her new life shattered, but who'd used those broken pieces to build something infinitely more valuable than what she'd lost. Victoria stepped out into the cool evening air, but she wasn't running toward anything or away from anything. She was just walking, one step at a time, toward a life that mattered because she'd chosen it rather than fallen into it, toward a family she'd earned rather than inherited, toward a version of herself she actually liked looking at in the mirror. The massive trillion-dollar empire she'd unknowingly walked away from had never been the real loss, but she understood that now. The real loss and the real gain in finding her way back had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the daily choice to be present, to be honest, to be someone her son could respect and her ex-husband could trust, and she herself could finally forgive. 5 years ago, she'd stood in the rain outside a crystal ballroom and felt her carefully constructed life crumble. But tonight, walking home to her small Brooklyn apartment with its terrible water pressure and great light, Victoria Matthews felt something she'd never felt in that Tribeca penthouse or at Douglas Pemberton's engagement party. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged, but more importantly, she felt like she'd earned the right to be there. And that, she'd learned, was worth more than all the trillion-dollar empires in the world.